Hi, I'm Andrew Corbett. One of the most controversial passages in the New Testament relates to something Christ said to his disciples. This has caused great confusion among many readers of the New Testament, and it has to do with what we assume is the second coming of Christ. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 28, Jesus said this, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." This is the last verse of Matthew chapter 16. It's argued that the fulfillment of this verse actually continues on into chapter 17 in a passage known as the Transfiguration of Christ. It's here that Christ goes up a mountain some 6 days later and is transfigured into his glory, where both Moses and Elijah appear to him. It's argued that this is the fulfillment of what Christ has just told his disciples. The problem with this, though, is that it doesn't fit the biblical language of the expression "the Lord is coming," or the coming of the Son of Man. Secondly, Jesus has already said in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 28 that there will be some standing here who will not taste death. 6 days later, none of them had tasted death. And yet, another way of saying what Jesus said is, most of you will be dead. In other words, there will be some who haven't tasted death. So most of you will have died by the time this happens. So it's impossible for the Transfiguration passage of Matthew chapter 17 to be the fulfillment of what Christ is saying here in chapter 16 and verse 28. So how can we understand what Christ is saying? This expression, the Son of Man is coming, or the Lord is coming, it's used throughout the Old Testament to speak of God intervening in judgment. We find this expression in Isaiah 19 and verse 1, where the prophet declares woe to Egypt, pronouncing their demise as a world power, when he says, "Woe unto you, Egypt! The Lord is coming to you, riding a cloud of chariot," or a chariot of cloud. This expression, "coming on the clouds," is an expression that's used in the Old Testament. We find other references to the Lord coming with a sense of the Lord coming in judgment. For example, Psalm 96 and so on, where there are other references that this is the language that Christ is using. In fact, it seems that he's drawing a very direct allusion to something Daniel said, and Christ will go on and use a very similar expression over in Matthew chapter 24, where he will talk of the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the heavens, where he's quoting from Daniel, where it talks about one like the Son of Man coming up to the Ancient of Days on the clouds. And it's an expression that is again conveying judgment, because the next sentiment in that Daniel passage speaks of judgment. And so how do we understand this? I think the most natural way to understand this, and one of the oldest ways to understand it dates back to some of the church fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries who understood it this way, is that Christ is speaking of his coming in judgment to end the old covenant, coming in judgment to bring to an end the old covenant. And of course, the old covenant, its elements, the temple, the priesthood and the sacrifices, were literally brought to an end in 70 AD. If we see this as the judgment of God on an apostate Israel that had rejected its Messiah, we are able to make this passage fit quite naturally. And Jesus is saying this is his coming. He will be coming in judgment. It's not necessarily an allusion to what's called the second coming, although the expression the second coming does not occur in the New Testament. So we have this way of understanding this passage and the other passages, perhaps in Matthew chapter 10, where he says you will not have finished going through the cities, all the cities of Judea before the Son of Man comes. And then again in Matthew 24, where he describes the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds in the context of Jerusalem's destruction. He says in a bit later on in Matthew 24 that this will all take place within the generation of this audience. So how do we best understand a passage like Matthew chapter 16 and verse 28? It's best understood through the grid of the Old Testament expression and biblical language. The Lord is coming, an expression of God's judgment. Jesus is saying He's coming to judge. He gave a parable of this in Matthew chapter 21, the parable of the vineyard, where He talks about coming and taking the kingdom and giving it away to a people that would bear fruit with that kingdom. So there's a picture of God's judgment that Jesus is giving. And here He's saying exactly that. Some of you, my disciples, will still be alive to see this. And historically we know, indeed, that was the case. I've written more about this in a little book called The Most Embarrassing Verse in the Bible, which is essentially based on this whole concept. If you'd like that, you can go to the website and see how you can order that either as an ebook or as a paperback book. I'm Andrew Corbett. For more information, please visit andrewcorbett.net.